One of the finest passenger steamers on the Atlantic is in trouble, breaking apart in a violent sea. Potential rescuers are nearby, but they choose to look on, refusing to render any aid. The passengers and crew are trapped as the ship buckles and floods, desperate for help, but the locals here have other, more sinister plans. On my channel, I always love telling stories of wrecks that have been forgotten. We explore not only a physical place, but also explore a story that has faded so much that it's become uncharted all over again. This is one of those stories, but even more so. A massive ship with a sizable loss of life, gone. It's barely even in the history books. We're traveling to Marie Joseph in Nova Scotia to see if anything at all still exists from this 165-year-old disaster.
Out in the channel over there, you see a very distant island. There's 2 outer islands over there, and just beyond that is a reef called Seal Ledges. And that is where the Indian has struck.
This is the story of the SS Indian on Part-Time Explorer. Marie Joseph, Nova Scotia is a quiet little hamlet along the eastern shore of the province. It's the kind of settlement that you pass through without even noticing it. I came across this disaster while researching my documentary on the wreck of the Hungarian in early 1860. Owned by the same company, the SS Indian crashed in the same part of the ocean only a few months before the Hungarian. Regular viewers of my channel will recall stories of Nova Scotia wrecks where the locals moved heaven and earth to rescue those in peril, such as with the Atlantic in 1873, or when they stood vigil through a blistering night, standing watch for anyone who might come ashore, such as with the Hungarian in 1860. But the residents here when the Indian came ashore in 1859 were oddly indifferent. Why?
The details of this wreck are unbelievably scant. Half a dozen newspaper articles exist, as well as a couple of first-hand accounts. From those, we'll do our best to piece together the details of this story.
The Indian belonged to the Montreal Ocean Steamship Company, better known as the Allan Line, based out of Montreal, even though many of their ships were registered to Glasgow, Scotland. The Indian was the company's second steamship, second to her older sister, the Canadian. The Indian and the Canadian were intended to sail between Canada and England, offering a voyage every 2 weeks as the two ships alternated back and forth. The Indian was built in 1854 by William Denny and Company in Dumbarton, Scotland, and launched on December 19th of that year. She had a gross tonnage of 1,764 and measured 277 feet in length. The Indian's early career was a busy one. As soon as she entered service, she was immediately requisitioned as a troop ship for the Crimean War, until being released in 1856 and returning to passenger service. For at least a couple of years, she was under the command of a Captain Thomas Jones, a determined sea captain who was loved by his crew and knew exactly how to get the most out of his ship. As the Allan Line's fleet expanded to include newer, bigger steamships, the older, slower Indian was seen as more of a secondary ship in the company's fleet, and yet, under Captain Thomas Jones, he was able to break company speed records using this slower ship in 1857. His crew wanted to celebrate this triumph, and commissioned a golden pocket watch presenting it as a gift for him with an inscription commemorating the achievement. In 1858, the ship transported a detachment of the 100th Regiment from Canada to England. This was the first corps of soldiers ever raised up in a British colony and sent back to England for regular military service, and yet the reception in Liverpool when they arrived was a cold one. Later that year, a new class of ships were introduced to the Allan Line, the Nova Scotia class, consisting of the Nova Scotian, the North Briton, the Hungarian, and the Bohemian. With them, the Indian's skilled captain, Captain Thomas Jones, was transferred to the brand new Hungarian, and the Indian's new captain was Captain William Smith. He was a skilled sea captain, but little more is known about him. It was now November 1859. The Indian was making preparations to depart from Liverpool across the Atlantic. During the winter months, the Allan Line steamers avoided the colder climates and the ice to the north by steaming along a more southerly route. Rather than sailing into Quebec, they actually steamed into Portland, Maine. This voyage would be the first crossing of this winter season along that southerly route. November 9th, with the midday high tide, the Indian departed the landing stage in Liverpool, steaming across the bar of the River Mersey and stopping in Queenstown, Ireland, to pick up more passengers, baggage, and mail.
On board the Indian are 38 passengers, 8 in saloon class, or first class, and 30 in steerage, mostly large families from Hungary and Germany. For this voyage, the crew of the Indian consists of about 100 men. Additionally, there were 300 tons of cargo and 800 tons of coal.
The voyage across the Atlantic was mostly uneventful. The first few days of the crossing were windy with light rain, followed by heavy fog for the following few days. One thing of note that was actually recorded was a steerage passenger, an Irishman whose name seems to be lost. He likely boarded in Queenstown and now was suffering from fits of delirium and was not well. Nearly on a daily basis, he would pack up all of his belongings and try to bribe the crew to drop him off at the nearest shore. He insisted that the Indian would never reach Portland, and he would not survive this voyage. The Indian was 10 days out of Liverpool when Captain Smith believed her to be approaching North America and had his crew begin taking soundings every hour. It's pretty straightforward. Essentially, a crewman throws a line overboard with a weight on the end, and that weight sinks down until it hits the sea floor. The crew, still holding on to the other end of the rope, are able to measure the ocean's depth by measuring that rope.
As time goes on and more soundings are taken, the captain and his officers will consult their navigational charts, which list off the depths. They'll have a rough idea as to where they are, and then they'll look for a pattern in these numbers that matches the soundings that they've been taking. Okay, so we've measured 15 fathoms here, and then after 10 miles of steaming, we're measuring 16 fathoms, and then after another 10 miles, here is 20 fathoms. With more measurements over time, even without being able to see around you, they'll be able to know roughly where they are on the chart, and therefore where they are in the sea.
Captain Smith believed he was just south of Cape Race, and sure enough, when the fog cleared, there was Cape Race. They were 18 miles to the south. From there, Smith put the ship on a course to continue on to Nova Scotia. Haze and fog fell once more the following day, and land was no longer visible. The ship was steaming at around 11 knots, and by noon on the following day, the captain believed that he would be in the vicinity of the Bunkero Bank to the southeast of Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. According to the chart, if that were the case, the depth there should be around 40 fathoms. Well, throughout the early afternoon, the crew took 4 different depth measurements and found the depth there to range between 30 and 43 fathoms, which solidified the captain's belief in their location and actually meant that they were drifting a little too far to the south towards the dreaded Sable Island. Not to be confused with Cape Sable Island, where the drama of the wreck of the Hungarian would take place only a couple of months later. Sable Island is a long island of sand 100 miles off of Nova Scotia, notorious for wrecking countless ships over the centuries. But it was no real big deal. According to the charts, they were still miles and miles off of the island. Still, the captain corrected the course and steered to the north away from the island.
Here's where everything went wrong. The soundings that the captain took did correspond with the depths around Sable Island, but that wasn't the only area on his nautical chart where those depths would have matched. The Indian was actually significantly north of Sable Island, closer to the Nova Scotian mainland, in an area with very similar depth soundings.
Now, incorrectly fixing this position may have been the captain's own error, but he was not alone in his misjudgment. He showed the results of the soundings to his crew and explained where he believes they were on the charts, and they agreed with him. In fact, it's perfectly reasonable to believe that you were in that water if you were presented with the same evidence, but he was sadly mistaken.
At 4 a.m. on the 21st, the captain, confident in their position, left the ship in the hands of Chief Officer James Stewart, and then he went to lie down. Chief Officer Stewart ordered the ship to travel at full speed, believing that there was plenty of open ocean ahead of them, and even ordered the aftermost sails be raised to boost the ship's speed even further. They believed that they had dozens of miles of open ocean ahead of them, but this just wasn't the case. Less than an hour later, through the fog, the crew thought that they had seen land just off the starboard side, but they weren't sure. If they did, it was probably that island over there. Playing it safe, the chief officer altered course slightly to the south, but this wasn't enough. Shortly after 5 o'clock, with the captain lying down and the chief officer on watch, the SS Indian struck Seal Ledges just off of Barren Island, just over my shoulder.
The ship was stuck on the rocks and flooding fast. The Indian was in a terrible situation, one that was all too common on the rocks of Nova Scotia in the latter half of the 1800s. The SS Atlantic of the White Star Line was wrecked like this in 1873 with a loss of around 550 people. The Allan Liner Hungarian, a running mate to the Indian, would end up like this only a couple months later. In both cases, the loss of life was appalling. Now here was the Indian, in treacherous seas with waves breaking against her hull. Captain Smith rushed onto the deck and began giving orders. Distress rockets were fired to call for the help of any nearby inhabitants. Next, the lifeboats were readied. The Indian carried 7 lifeboats, more than enough for the 138 souls on board. If the situation was handled properly, there was hope for everybody. The sea was raging, and Captain Smith deemed it safer aboard the Indian than in those small wooden boats. So he ordered the passengers stay aboard the ship and some of the crew be sent out in 2 lifeboats. The idea was that those crewmen would go ashore, find help, and come back and rescue the remainder of the people on board, including all of the passengers. And to be clear, the captain was staying behind on the ship too, to watch over them. But against his orders, steerage passengers forced their way into one of the first lifeboats to leave the ship, lifeboat number 2. While lowering, the davit collapsed, dropping the boat into the water. The breaking waves quickly capsized the boat, killing all of the occupants. A second boat, lifeboat number 1, was launched from the starboard side. It dangled on the falls just above the water, jammed there. Those aboard it shouted for people on deck to cut the falls. The falls are the ropes that the boat was hanging by. They did so, and the boat slapped down with such violence that several occupants were launched out of it, drowning them. But the boat seems to have recovered, and a few inside reached the safety of the mainland a short distance away. 2 other lifeboats were launched, at least one of them defying the captain's orders and abandoning those left behind on the ship. One of the 2 lifeboats made it to shore safely, but the other was pulled out to sea, vanishing. As daylight began to break, the ship strained and groaned with each wave. It had settled on the ledge, and the decks were all well above the surface, but the hull was beginning to flex. The bow was the high ground, and most of the people still on board, including all of the women and children, moved to the front of the ship. Near the stern of the ship, though, were the Indians' remaining lifeboats, and fearing that the ship was beginning to go, the captain ordered lifeboat number 6 to be launched. He put all of the remaining women and children into that one lifeboat. It was heaved over the side into the raging seas and successfully navigated to shore. The women and children were safe. At this point, there were still around 30 people aboard the Indian, and the lifeboats were gone. The signal cannon and distress rockets were firing up into the air. Captain Smith urgently needed assistance, but nobody was coming.
Several local schooners came in close to look at the stranded ship, but none of them offered to help. In fact, Captain Smith did his best to signal them and get their attention. One of them even came in within 300 yards, close enough to plainly see the crew of the Indian on the deck, before it just sailed away. The locals appeared to be ignoring the Indian.
It was now 6 a.m., nearly an hour after the ship had struck, and the hull began to buckle. Suddenly the ship split, the forward masts fell, and the bow section detached, rolling away to port, and slowly it began to settle into the sea. That was previously the ship's high point, so most of the people still on board had been congregating up there. A line was strung from the sinking forward section to the still stable after portion, and around 20 or 30 men were able to climb across this line to the safety of the stern. All but one man who refused to go. It was the old Irishman who had insisted that the ship was going to wreck. He shouted that he would never make it across the line to safety and that his time was up. The survivors on the stern shouted for him to try as the ship continued to separate, the line stretching tighter, the bow sinking ever deeper, but he refused to take his chance. Suddenly the bow gave way completely, rolling into the sea, and the Irishman was lost. The stern section was stable, and now all that those on board had to do was wait. Those remaining aboard the stern were stranded for hours, still attempting to signal for help.
One schooner from Marie Joseph eventually did go out to try to help, leaving from roughly this spot and sailing out into the channel. It got caught in the breakers and wrecked. Now, the crew on board did manage to survive, but they were unable to help those aboard the Indian. It wasn't until late afternoon when 2 rescue boats from Marie Joseph were finally launched, coming out and rescuing the remaining people off of the Indian.
The final death toll is hard to say. 19 is what was initially reported, 9 in steerage, including 2 women and 3 children, and 10 crew. However, the purser later reported 27 was the final count. The captain later described the loss as, quote, "not that bad."
Some of the survivors took shelter here in Marie Joseph, likely being taken in by some of the locals. But other survivors who landed elsewhere were exposed to the elements throughout the night, only finding civilization the next day. As the night passed, Captain Smith scoured the area trying to find people that he could hire to help him guard the wreck from looters, but he couldn't find anybody. It wasn't until the next day when he was able to hitch a ride back out to the wreck. And when he did, he found 2 schooners tied up alongside the Indian with their crew aboard the ship. They were absolutely pilfering the vessel. Now, they were showing interest in the Indian.
He climbed aboard quietly and began stealthily searching through the ship. The ship had been ransacked. The ship's dishes and silverware, her cargo, and anything else of value had been neatly organized in the ship's ladies' saloon and was being offloaded onto these 2 schooners. It was all very methodical. And that's when Captain Smith realized why so many schooners came in close to look but didn't help. Like vultures, they were waiting to see if the ship had been deserted. Was everybody dead yet so they could come in and pick it clean? When they saw it wasn't, they backed off. What's more is they weren't simply taking the ship's fittings. One could argue that, okay, it's going to be destroyed soon, someone might as well have it. But they were taking the passengers' personal belongings. Most of these people were still alive on shore, but their clothes were gone. Their valuables were gone. Every suitcase was broken open and emptied. As a result of these looters, many of the survivors, particularly the steerage immigrants, were left destitute. The survivors were eventually brought down to Halifax and made their way to their destinations. Charges were filed against some of the looters and several men were brought to trial. One man, a man named Berna, was arrested in the night and his house was searched. They found an expensive paisley scarf that matched the description of one that was stolen from a passenger, but he said it was his wife's. He scoffed at them, asking, "Can a poor person not also afford a scarf like this?" But upon closer inspection, it was found to be absolutely drenched with seawater, and he was brought to trial. While the location of these trials seems to be forgotten, and certainly the courthouse that they took place in is gone, the nearby museum of Sherbrooke Village has a period courthouse that gives us an idea of the building that these trials might have taken place in.
He stood trial briefly, but these rural courts were no match for a case of this importance, and the jails seemed unable to contain the men who were accused. In most cases, the defendants seemed to just walk away from the trials with ease.
The museum also has a jail similar to the ones that briefly contained the looters.
Right now, we're into the Sherbrooke Jail, which was opened in 1862, never closed till 1968. So, of course, this was quite a port for shipbuilding in the early days. And then, of course, the gold rush came here in 1861, and we decided we'd build the jail the next year in order to curb some of the drinking and what went along with that.
And interestingly enough, this jail has graffiti carved into it that looks like an Allan liner. On November 26th, almost a week after the disaster, some good news was reported. A schooner from Prince Edward Island arrived in Boston after having picked up survivors in a lifeboat off the coast of Nova Scotia. It was the lifeboat that had been dragged out to sea and disappeared. Inside of it were about half a dozen crewmen from the Indian, and all of them were safe. The rest of the surviving crew, also taken to Halifax with the passengers, were picked up by the Allan liner Hungarian on December 7th, 1859. The Hungarian was under the command of Captain Thomas Jones, the old record-setting captain who previously had commanded the Indian. I'm standing on the waterfront in downtown Halifax, and it's around here on December 7th, 1859, that the Hungarian steamed in. Past this wharf
heading up that way to pick up the survivors from the Indian, and they picked up 6 officers and 50 sailors.
The Indians' connection with the Hungarian didn't end there. The looting of the Indian and the loss of so much personal property and cargo was a scandal that tarnished the reputation of Nova Scotia. And 3 months later, when the SS Hungarian of the same company as the Indian crashed into Nova Scotia, the provincial government took extra steps to make sure that the incident didn't repeat itself. Normally when a ship wrecks, it's the job of the ship's officers, with the help of the local authorities, to protect the wreckage from looters, not abandoning the ship per se, because if the ship is abandoned, it is up for grabs. They have to stand by it for as long as possible. But the provincial government, this time when the Hungarian wrecked, in order to avoid a repeat, they sent their own officer down to the wreckage, and they gave him jurisdiction over those local authorities.
This offended the locals because they thought that it implied that they were incapable of protecting the wreck from looters. Which was right, because it got looted anyway, although not nearly as bad as the Indian.
The wreck of the Indian today is long gone. It was only a week after the disaster when it was reported to have fully sunk under the waves. When it comes to forgotten shipwrecks, this is an all-time low, considering the size of the ship and the death toll, and a visit to several possible archives throughout the province yielded no results.
There is nothing left to indicate that the Indian went down just over here. There's no markers, there's no plaques, there's nothing. I don't even think there's a single building left from the time of the Indian. Everything since then has been torn down and new buildings built in their place. I would love to have been able to organize an expedition to go out to the wreck site of the Indian to see if we could do a survey and find out if there are remnants of the Indian down there. But I'm told there's nothing left. It was a wooden ship, so the hull would be long gone. What might still be there are remnants of boilers or other machinery, but even that is not very likely considering all the storms tearing through there and the strong currents.
The lasting legacy of this wreck is the fact that the ship was stripped of anything of value within days of the disaster, and yet I couldn't find anything. That's not to say there isn't something out there, but it's all buried away, if there is.
I even did my best to hunt down artifacts that some people might have, walking up to some of the locals and just asking them, what do you know about this wreck? Do you know anything about things that were taken off of it? Some people did know of items, but they've sold them all since then, which is a shame, because I would have bought it. I can't find any graves, although there must be some somewhere. The oldest cemetery in the area is the old Smith's Cove Cemetery, along a very long dirt road that my van was ill-equipped to go down, but we did it anyway. The mosquitoes and flies were a black cloud that just swarmed me as soon as I got out of the car. But I did look around for a little bit. I checked as many graves as I could. Some of them went back to the 1860s. I couldn't find anything from the 1850s and nothing marked Indian.
Marie Joseph is a quiet town today, as it has been since the time of the wreck, going about its business indifferent to the drama that unfolded here over 165 years ago. This video, I hope, shines light on the story and prevents it from slipping away beyond memory. It's worth taking a moment to point out the 2 old fishing boats rotting away on the Marie Joseph waterfront. This boatyard is where several boats sat rotting away, although most of the larger vessels have been cleared away already. These 2 wooden boats aren't particularly old, but they've been sitting out exposed to the elements and the sea air without any maintenance for almost 2 decades, and are now falling apart. They don't connect to the wreck of the Indian in any way, but they're worth looking at while we're here. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and share the video around. Keep an eye out also for the VFX reel of these animations on the HFX channel. Be sure to also visit my Patreon at the link below, or consider signing up for my YouTube channel memberships. A special thank you to my supporters on Patreon, especially Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Friedrich III, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Glenn Biddiscombe, Stephen Schwankerts, Gabriel Colomb, RGB, Tara Mulikar, Keith Holland, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Masella, Cole Tannick, Sophie Baber, Rob, Oliver Chin-Chen, John Maluski, David Watipka, Tiffany Raridan, Mad Time Media, Nathan Gutierrez, Max Metcalf, David Littlejohn, Sean Sahi Fraser, Nikki Chan 92, Corbin McDonald, Matthew Burns, Goblin of the Salt Plains, Luke Stevens, Gordon Robbins, Aaron Stark, Troy Wentworth, Clarkey, Sam Forker, Busy Bee, Christopher Rosendale, Road Weary, Kitty Bits, Taniel 38, Kenzo Buick, Brian Reedy, Eden Cleefish, Bless Moles, Coda Yoda 16, Carol Adams, Clay Hobbs, Steve Valley, Gojira's Trains, J.C. Hobbs, High Treason, The Peppermilk, Tristan White, Jason Stray, and Chance Hudson.